Okay, thank you very much. And as the introduction said, my name is Paul Dawson. I'm from the Metropolitan Police Service. I'm their research manager, so I head up a civilian research team based within the police service, within the London Metropolitan Police Service. Today, I will speak to you for about 35 minutes about a piece of research that I led on integrated offender management. And before I start, I should say it's a really great pleasure to be in Norrköping to try and share some of the learning that I will speak about to the work that's happening here at the moment. So as hopefully I will talk about, a lot of the challenges that my work discusses are very similar to a lot of the challenges that are present in Sweden at the moment. So I think there's a really good opportunity to share learning across the two countries. So the scheme that I will talk about today is called the Diamond Initiative. And that essentially was London's first integrated offender management scheme. This scheme was based on 4 main principles, and these are on the slides in front of you. The main premise behind Diamond was the IOM approach. That is a consensus, a multi-agency approach. Partners coming together, sharing skills, training, staff, to focus their resources on needy offenders. It was also based on some American research called the $1 Million Block program, which essentially described how offenders will live in certain communities. Therefore, by focusing resource on those communities, we can try and really break the cycle of reoffending. Now, the Diamond scheme was essentially a 2-year pilot scheme that ran for 2 years in 6 key areas in London. As I mentioned, it was a multi-agency, so police, probation, local authority, local council, housing, employment, all came together to try and target offenders' needs to reduce reoffending. And evaluation was built into that scheme. I was asked at the very beginning to conduct a robust evaluation so we can understand if this scheme is working or not. And what I should say before I move on is the Diamond scheme targeted offenders who came out of prison with a less than a 12-month sentence. So offenders coming out of prison were offered this Diamond scheme to turn their life around. Now, at the time when this was released, as I said, this was the very first IOM scheme in London. At the time, there was a lot of political changes happening away from central localized programs to local programs. And this Diamond Initiative was the first London IOM. It was also the first local IOM in London. So it was a very original and innovative scheme to tackle reoffending. And I was asked to conduct a robust evaluation of that scheme. And this slide just talks about the technique that I used in my evaluation. I essentially did a process piece and an impact piece. The process piece was all aimed so I could understand why and how of the scheme. How has it worked? How has it been set up? How has it been implemented? I really wanted to understand the experiences of the staff and the offenders in the Diamond scheme. And to do this, I did a range of methodologies. I did regular staff surveys. So I asked staff their opinions at key points over the 2 years of the scheme. I also conducted interviews with staff and with offenders in year 1 and in year 2 of the scheme. This is quite an original methodology because a lot of evaluations just come at the end of the scheme and say, how did you set the scheme up? What I wanted was to track their opinions throughout the 2 years of the scheme. And the other aspect that I'll talk about is the impact aspect. I wanted to demonstrate if this scheme was having an impact on the reoffending of the offenders being worked with. So what I want to talk about is the learning from this scheme. And the first section is all about the process, so how the scheme was set up and the learning that came out of the research. The next few slides all have a very similar theme, and that's the theme of a scheme being set up, but experiencing a range of problems in that setup. So the first slide talks about the staffing and the training of the staff at the beginning of the scheme. So, for example, in terms of staff, obviously there are lots of agencies that came together to try and work with these offenders. Different agencies had different ways of selecting and identifying staff to put on their diamond team. So there was difficulty at the beginning to actually recruit staff for the scheme. Some police staff were told they had to work on the diamond scheme. And as I'll discuss later, some police staff didn't like the concept of diamond. They saw their role as arresting offenders and not in terms of rehabilitation of offenders. And likewise, my second point on the slide is about training. The staff at the beginning of this scheme didn't have training on what was expected of them. They didn't know what the other partners in their team could do. So the police staff weren't clear what the probation staff could do. So they didn't know how to best work well together. Now this improved over the 2 years of the scheme, but at the beginning there was a lot of confusion as to what the diamond team was supposed to do. And I'll also touch on this later, but there were some tensions between police and probation that were never really resolved. So the police staff sometimes didn't like the probation staff, and the probation staff didn't like the police staff. So there were cultural tensions within the diamond teams in terms of working together to reduce reoffending. And likewise, in these early setting up of the scheme, accommodation was a real challenge for a lot of the schemes. Some schemes were set up and were expected to work before they were given the appropriate equipment, before they had computers, before they had fully functioning offices. So one scheme for the first 2 or 3 months were based in a very, very small office, the size of a bathroom, very small. And there's no way they could work with offenders in that environment. And likewise, the last point on this slide is about the IT systems. At the beginning, there was no case management IT system for the staff to record what they do with the offenders. And once again, this improved over time. But at the beginning, the staff were using paper records to record what they were doing with the offenders. Now, as an evaluator, I would find it very difficult to evaluate something that was only keeping paper records on what they were doing with their offenders. And once again, this is something that improved over time. But at the beginning, the point that this all heads towards is that offender management schemes take time to bed in. And that time isn't always acknowledged by political audiences or other staff involved. This scheme was set up too quickly, and they tried to deliver it before they were fully able to. So that's really key learning in terms of implementing and delivering a program of this type to reduce reoffending. The next main point I want to talk about from the process side is whether the police, whether IOM, is able to identify the needs of their offenders and target their needs. Because we know that offender management can be effective, but the key aspect is identifying the needs of the offenders. So there are 2 tables on this slide. The top one talks about the needs that the offenders presented. So, for example, 75% of diamond offenders had education or training or job needs. 64% had psychological needs, and so on all the way down. What the slide is on the bottom left is the agency involvement. So I was able to look at the needs of the offenders and compare that to the needs of actually the staff and what partners the staff had to address those needs. So what's interesting for me is that the lines in blue are local authority and housing. Those areas improved over the 2 years of the Diamond scheme. At the beginning, only 18% of staff said they had housing on board within their Diamond initiative. At the end of the scheme, that was up to 67%. So that improved over time, which is good because 54% of Diamond offenders had an accommodation problem. So it's a good thing that that improved. But the two areas in red are education and mental health. These areas didn't improve at all through the 2 years of the scheme. Now that's interesting because a key issue for Diamond offenders was mental health. But as we see, mental health agencies were not involved in Diamond. 2% at the beginning and 9% at the end reported that they had mental health agencies on board their scheme. So the question really is, in terms of integrated offender management, are we able to identify the needs of the offenders? And are we then able to identify the right partners to bring on board to meet those needs? The London Diamond Initiative had problems in identifying those partners. And that is so important for integrated offender management, bringing these key agencies together, sharing information, sharing data, sharing knowledge, sharing skills. That's a key aspect that has to be done right for offender management to work. I touched on this section earlier, and this is in terms of the organizational cultures and some of the working tensions within the Diamond teams. Now, as I said, the team members generally work well together, but there were working tensions throughout the 2 years of the scheme. Probation staff, prison staff, police staff, housing staff, they didn't like each other that much. So the working tensions, they weren't clear what each other's roles were. They didn't know how to work well together. And that is, once again, so important in terms of delivering an integrated offender management program, is a team of staff that fully understand each other's roles so they can work well together. Now, this is something that can be addressed and predicted at the very beginning of a scheme. If we're setting up a new integrated offender management scheme, we can have training at the beginning of that scheme so all the partners know who they are and they know what their roles are. The other key point for me on this slide is a question I had at the bottom point. In terms of, I interviewed both prison, police, probation, lots of staff. Now, Diamond teams were led by police staff. So police led the Diamond teams. A lot of probation and prison staff wondered why that was the case. They thought they should lead offender management schemes. So once again, there's one of these key tensions that arose throughout the 2 years of the scheme that was never really resolved. But the issue can be predicted from the very beginning when we're setting up a multi-agency team that has to be able to work well together. And the last slide I'll discuss in this aspect of the presentation is the viewpoint of the offenders. So I spoke to offenders in both year 1 and in year 2 of my research, and they were very, very positive about their experience. They all spoke about how Diamond changed their life, how if it wasn't for Diamond, they weren't sure what would happen to them. And it was quite powerful. Many of the offenders were very prolific, long-term offenders, but they spoke in how the Diamond had changed their views of the police. They'd never experienced police officers trying to help them before, only try to arrest them. And that was very interesting when I heard long-term criminals speak positively about the police. I found that quite powerful. The next part of the presentation, I want to talk about the impact. So did Diamond have an impact on the offending of the individuals it was working with? I won't talk too much about the research and the statistics I used, but essentially the approach I designed was called a quasi-experimental approach, where I matched offenders on Diamond on key individual characteristics and area characteristics. And I matched them to similar offenders with similar background who lived in similar areas. So it's a very strong control group I developed, so I could really understand the impact of the scheme. This slide just has some of the details about the matching. So I matched on population, crime levels, deprivation, sentence length, age. My Diamond offenders and my control group were very similar in terms of the background, age, criminal offending, criminal history. It's a very good match. I had a lot of confidence. And it means I can be more confident when I talk about the findings as to whether Diamond has worked or not. Now, the final slide before I speak about the impact is this pie chart, which is essentially just sets the scene in terms of how many offenders started Diamond, started and dropped out, started and finished. It's that breakdown. So the three colorful boxes in the pie chart are those that completed, dropped out, or refused to start Diamond. The two gray boxes are the boxes where the staff weren't able to contact the offender to offer them the scheme of Diamond. Now this is interesting for me because the Diamond staff spent a lot of time trying to identify people, about trying to track the offenders down, going to their house to offer them Diamond. Now, in terms of the impact of Diamond, as you can see, the first yellow box it tells us that there's no impact of Diamond. This was a 12-month reconviction analysis. So I looked at when they started Diamond, the first 12 months of their life post-Diamond. How many of them committed an offense within that time? And what we see is that 42% of the Diamond referrals, so everyone that was referred to the scheme, 42% reoffended within the first year. In terms of the control group that I developed, once again, it's 42% reoffended. So we see no difference in terms of whether we made a difference in terms of Diamond. And it's the interesting aspect for me on this slide is in the UK, we have special techniques to predict reoffending, so risk assessment scores. And both of these two groups perform exactly as we would have predicted. But I also looked at the next box down, the blue box. Those are Diamond participants. So those are people that engaged and completed the scheme. And once again, we see no difference between those individuals and the control group. But that measure is just, did they commit an offense, yes or no? And that's a very blunt measure. So this is going into slightly more detail in terms of how many offenses these individuals committed. And what we see is essentially, once again, no difference between the two groups in how many offenses they commit. So the red line is the Diamond offenders. The blue line is my control group. As we can see, there's no difference between the two groups. The line down the middle is when they were released from prison and started Diamond. And for the control group, it's when they were released from prison but didn't start Diamond. What we see, and what I think this really shows, which is very important, is the need for a control group and good research. Because if I had not had a control group for this piece of work, I would just see the red line. I would just see that Diamond offenders, before they were released from prison, were going up in their offending. I would see them being sent to prison. I would see them coming out of prison and their offending decreasing. The control group have exactly the same trend, leading up to their prison sentence and after prison. And once again, I also looked at other aspects of offending to see, was there any impact that this diamond scheme had had on offending? And the answer is no. So I looked at, the first graph is how quickly they reoffended. And what we see is that those that reoffended on diamond did so quite quickly. So they were released from prison and they reoffended quite quickly, which is important, and I'll talk later about this being a window of opportunity to when best to work with offenders, not just on prison release, but prior to prison release. And the second graph at the bottom is the severity of their offenses. I wanted to see if their severity changed. Did we change them from burglars to shoplifters? Did we lower their offending type? And once again, the answer is no. They were exactly the same as our control group. So there is no evidence of an impact on offending in the Diamond Initiative. There were some promising signs in terms of those individuals that were violent criminals. They had more positive results for the violent offenders. And there are also some signs that those individuals that had their debt and personal finance issues addressed did better after Diamond. Some signs of success. But what's very important for me on this slide is the bottom point, in that what I've talked about so far are the offenders from the first year of the Diamond scheme. When I looked at offenders in the second year of the scheme, they had better results. Now that's interesting because that echoes back to what I was saying about the implementation and the delivery. So when IWM was delivered better, the results were better. So in the final section, I'll just talk about some key learning from my research and how I think integrated offender management has to be designed to be effective. The first point that I want to make is that the Diamond scheme doesn't show us that IOM does not work. We know that offender management can work. I evaluated in the Home Office a scheme called the Prolific and Other Priority Offenders Program. It was a similar scheme to Diamond, but preceded Diamond, so it's before Diamond. That was a similar scheme about multi-agency working to target offenders, and that was shown to be successful. So we know offender management can work. But the key point for me is number one on this slide, that the integrated offender management, it has to be implemented and designed well. So on Diamond, we saw teams being set up too quickly, without training, without a clear model of how they should work, because they were pressured to start too quickly. The key aspect here is that IOM can take time to set up and bed in, and it has to be set up and designed correctly. The second point for me, number two on this slide, is very important, and this is the concept of the need to work in partnerships together. That's not only the service provision to identify the needs of the offenders and to identify the right agencies to meet those needs. It's about sharing information. It's about co-location. This is integrated offender management. The staff from probation, police, drugs, housing have to work together. There has to be a real commitment from all the agencies to work together to target the offenders, to reduce reoffending. If they don't work together effectively, they won't reduce reoffending. That is so important. Point 3 on this slide is my point on the cultural tensions and how the agencies are able to work together. That is so important. That is addressed at the beginning of an integrated offender management scheme, that all the staff know what each other can do and they know what their roles are. And finally, some wider learning from my research The first point is this idea of a window of opportunity, that the earlier we can work with offenders prior to prison release, the better. We really need to be working with offenders whilst they're still in prison to help their transition to the community. That is so important, because offenders will come out of prison and they will reoffend quite quickly. So the earlier we work with them, the better. But this also shows me, as my second bullet point, that initiatives such as the Diamond Scheme can be subject to robust evaluation. And there's a real need for evaluation to be built into these schemes. As I said, if I hadn't had my control group, I would have come to the conclusion that Diamond worked and was a great success. So that evaluation aspect was so important, and the research aspect is so important. The two more points from this slide. One is the concept that criminal behavior cannot be turned off like a light bulb. The offenders that Diamond worked with were prolific offenders. They started offending when they were 14 and 15. To expect them to stop offending straight away is quite naive. It takes time to work with these offenders. And the final point on the slide, which you can just see at the bottom, is that the learning from Diamond, what I've talked about, is currently feeding into the development of a new version of IOM in London. And what I'm trying to do in London is to have one model of IOM. So one model that all the partner agencies, all the different areas of London can sign up to. And it will ensure a consistent approach to integrated offender management. Once again, because that is so important. Because at the moment in London, we have 32 boroughs, 32 areas of London. Each borough is doing something different in terms of integrated offender management. So you have an inconsistent, fragmented picture. What I want to do in London is to have a very clear picture, one model of integrated offender management. Finally, just while I wrap up, when Diamond results were released in the UK, there was lots of press reaction. I'm not sure you'll have heard of the newspapers I'll talk about, but there was lots of very negative reaction to Diamond. I won't talk about the details of the newspapers. One's quite a well-known, respected newspaper, and the other newspaper on the right, The Sun, isn't a very well-respected newspaper. And they all reported Diamond in very different ways, using very different language. But they all focused on one aspect, the fact that IOM doesn't work. That's all the media talked about after my research was published, which is completely the wrong learning to take from Diamond. Because as I said, we know that offender management can work, but it has to be set up, delivered in the right way with the right partners. And if there's only one aspect of this that I can make you remember, it will be that IOM can work, but it has to be delivered and designed in the right way with the right partners. And finally, the Diamond research is published, it's online. I'm not sure if my presentation can be sent around, but anyone that's interested, my email was on the very first slide, and on the last slide is the link to where my report was published on Diamond. And on the very first slide was my email address. So I'm happy to take questions, and either now or electronically. And thank you very much for your time.